Hello, all. Welcome to this Propeller LinkedIn Live, where today we'll be exploring what we're calling the new change universe. Today we'll discuss three key topics on what we're seeing as change management as a discipline being pushed in today's drastically different environment. My name is Riley Smith, and I lead our people and change services at Propeller, often leading transformation initiatives with complex integrated change. And with me is Keely Middleton, who's one of our senior change consultants at Propeller, having led change projects across a multitude of tech, process, and organizational change. We're excited to be here. We're excited to be hosting this session. We did receive some questions ahead of this call through our survey and some direct messages via LinkedIn, which will infuse into our time today. Additionally, if you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the chat. We'll be stopping at least 3 different times throughout, not just holding them to the end to answer those questions. We'll do our best to answer all, but if we don't, happy to follow up with those individually. Before we dive into these topics, I did want to spend some time on what we're calling the new change universe. I call it new because the quote that often describes our discipline is quite old, like Greek philosopher old. Widely attributed to the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, had to practice that several times. The quote, "Change is constant," has been said many, many times in the rooms that we exist in as change managers, and many, many more times afterwards. But in today's world of digitalization, AI, global economies, markets shifting on daily new information, I actually think that's the wrong quote for our profession nowadays. It's not that change is ever present. It's that the nature of change has actually changed. So over the last several years, we've noticed 4 traits that are showing up across nearly every transformation we support, whether in different industries, different clients, different technologies, all the same patterns. And that is change today is fast, it's cross-functional, it's cumulative, and increasingly surprising. Doesn't roll off the tongue like change is constant, but these 4 shifts have fundamentally changed what leadership does and kind of acts through transformation. So constant first, change is fast. Organizations used to have transformation seasons. You launched an initiative, stabilized the business, learned from it, and then moved on to the next project. Today, leaders aren't just managing change anymore. They're managing the speed of change, particularly in our AI world. And that speed changes everything. It compresses decision-making. It shortens learning cycles. It leaves less time for managers to reinforce new behaviors before shifts happen again. In fact, it's not uncommon for clients to use one change, a new technology, for instance, to spur other change in parallel. Again, that'd be fine if it's truly waterfall with clear hypercare periods, clear kickoffs, but that cascading effect isn't often waterfall. And sometimes that domino effect, as I mentioned, is in parallel of the source of the change, blurring the lines between go lives and kickoffs. In the survey we sent and attached to this event, nearly 9 in 10 respondents reported an unsustainable pace, stretched teams, or saturation affecting performance. So even in our research supporting this event, change is fast. Second, change is cross-functional. One decision rarely stays contained anymore. A finance decision affects operation. An operating model decision affects HR. Technology implementation changes governance. Of course, a restructure changes our customer experience. The connective tissue between functions has become much tighter than many organizations appreciate, which means leaders can't optimize one part of the organization without affecting another. And this makes total sense as we continue to integrate technologies, optimize supply chains in service of our customers, personalize offers to shoppers, or manage master data in service of multiple needs across the company. As just a few examples, our most advanced competitive and value-driving projects will be cross-functional. And this is different in the past where change could be siloed, and that's just not as frequent anymore. Third, change is cumulative, and this is kind of more of an outcome of the first 2. And Keely will actually be discussing change saturation as a topic more later, but I see this as truly where most orgs struggle. And that is every function, kind of every sub-function, every team has a strategy, a roadmap, priority KPIs. They all move work, and they often include changing, optimizing, moving. reconfiguring, deprecating, reorging, merging, like my change thesaurus is now kicked in. And all of that is cross-functional and quick. And what happens is these experiences stack on top of each other, creating what we know as change fatigue. It's rarely one initiative that creates overload. It's the accumulation of 10 well-intentioned and intentional initiatives that were never viewed together and without a full picture of how stakeholders impacted. In that same survey I mentioned earlier, more than half of our respondents said saturation is addressed only after problems emerge, and more than half said it's discussed but not measured. Again, Keely will explore this a little bit later. And finally, and this one comes out of our research from last year in our People and Change Insights report, change has become more surprising. And I don't mean surprising because organizations don't know change is coming. Leaders absolutely expect change. But what's happening is it's more difficult for our leaders to predict where it will emerge, how much of it there will be, and kind of how different changes will interact with one another. In fact, one of the findings that I appreciate from our research, from a particular interview that I had, executives consistently struggled to accurately predict the amount of change they'd experience from one year to another. I'm reminded of one of my VP interviews where she said, I walked into 2025 thinking I knew the 3 big projects that we would need to shepherd. Well, it ended up being 7, and one of the original 3 didn't even kick off. So this validated in our quantitative results where organizations underestimate the amount of change, and particularly across categories like technology, L&D, and organizational restructuring were often underestimated by 20 points. Now, you could say this is a forecasting problem, but I think it's evidence we're operating in an environment where change no longer follows a predictable sequence. And when leaders successfully anticipate initiatives, they're often still surprised at what comes next. So the implication, if change is harder to predict, then the competitive advantage isn't getting better at forecasting. It's building organizations that it can absorb uncertainty, adapt quickly, and have the change muscle to create clarity when the future isn't knowable. And that's why I think upending the change in this constant narrative is so important, and hence why I say it's fast, cross-functional, cumulative, and surprising. While it can sound daunting, I think this narrative helps us. It helps us reframe the new change universe. It provides more space for change to be at the forefront. It should enable deeper conversations at the strategy and planning levels. And it should help build the case for more change leadership skill development in your organization. It should catalyze momentum around change COE and capability builds additionally. And it should just help us all elevate this, from a narrative perspective and storytelling perspective at our organizations. So that's the setting we find ourselves in. And digging deeper into this change universe today, we have 3 relevant and noteworthy topics we'll be discussing. Keely will be taking you through the first 2. Change teams must operate at the system level, not the project level, as well as change capacity is finite but not fixed. And I'll be walking you through the 3rd one about how adoption is not the finish line, business value is. So with that being said, thank you for letting me set the scene for the change universe, and let me pass it along to my colleague, Keely.
Thank you, Riley. Thank you everyone for joining us. So to kick us off and to feed off of Riley's intro here, I want to talk about how we need to adjust ourselves as change teams and change managers when we're looking at the projects. And this is because historically we've deployed change managers or change teams on this project by project basis, right? But as change is moving and accelerating the way it is, right, as Riley kind of talked through those 4 pieces, we also need to shift to how we're actually approaching change management and how we're delivering change as projects. And this requires us to be more strategic. It requires us to look at a higher level and to manage change at the organization level or at the system level. And the why behind this is because employees experience that cumulative impact of change that Riley mentioned. And it means that we're no longer experiencing change one at a time. So therefore, our approach to change should also work the same. And that will bring us to our next piece on kind of the key pieces of how we think about this. And so when I say the portfolio view or that system view, what do I mean? So instead of looking at an individual project or your project plan, I'm talking about a change across the whole system or the entire organization. So historically, this means that when we start off on a project, we're looking at a change impact assessment. We're trying to track all the individual things that are happening within that project, that specific change. But because things are so cross-functional, as Riley mentioned, and because they're cumulative, I want us to take a deeper look at everything that's happening. And because I want to know just not the changes that are happening, but I want to know which teams are being hit and how they are connected. And the best example I have of this is we were at a client and I was the change lead on a performance management upgrade. So it was impacting all employees, about 20,000 employees in one way or another. And it was performance management. So it's a high anticipated one that everyone cares about. And it was a high priority project, right? It had already been blessed by the CEO. He had spoken about it both internally and externally in the market about the new changes that were happening. And it was impacting, again, all 20,000 employees in some shape or format. And because it's performance management, a critical piece for us is going to be the middle management, right? We have to get middle management on board for this change. So me being the change lead on this project goes and builds a comms plan for how we're going to engage our middle managers on this project. And to do so, I need to get on town halls and newsletters. So I go through the comms team to try and get on the upcoming agenda. They basically told me no. And not because the agendas for the upcoming town halls were too full, but because there's already too many things happening on the middle managers' plates. Because this middle group already had too many changes happening in Q3, they said that this project couldn't go live. Again, this is a project that's already been blessed by the CEO. We now are being told that our timeline can't go because there's already too many things happening for our middle managers. And at the time, that's a very frustrating experience because I have to go back to the project team. We're running timelines. We ultimately got our whole project pushed back by a couple months because of this. But later on, it's one of those greatest lessons learned is that this team, who was kind of the gatekeeper for all the different communications that were going out, was able to say, hey, there's too many things happening for this specific group at this time period. It's not going to work. Like you cannot have this change also go. And they were using the comms channels as the gatekeeper to do it. But I thought it was a beautiful lesson. And they were able to see all the changes that were happening. And maybe not just all the changes, they were able to see all the things that were on those middle managers' plates in order to have the ability to say no to that specific change. And again, I thought it was this really wonderful piece because they were able to see that cumulative impact. They were able to surface the risks, and therefore we had to change our own timelines and our own sequencing for that project. And it was a really good lesson on that portfolio level view of things happening across the entire organization. And I know that's an idealistic case, right? Sometimes we don't always have that full system level view. And I think that sometimes our organizational structures kind of fight against us in a way. A lot of times we'll see change managers or project managers happening within individual departments. So like IT often has their own PM or CM space, or sometimes HR or talent will have theirs. So it's about connecting the dots across these different organizational pieces, those functional pieces, if you don't have a global or system-wide one, so that you can kind of see and connect the dots between not just the changes that I'm in charge of, but the changes that are happening across, so we can have that visibility for that. And if we can do that, if we can create that visibility, we can see again those cumulative impacts, and we can start to see that the changes that are happening across the organization, so we can have that better success. Because we know that success is no longer just when one project launches successfully or when one audience has adopted. It's whether the organization achieved outcomes it was trying to create across multiple changes happening at once. And that's where this becomes that strategic role, right? This is where I want change managers to kind of rethink of their role and like rethink of how we approach change in the modern era. And that's because we should be that connecting piece. We should be that strategic connector from the strategy to the initiatives to the people. How are we representing our people and the initiatives and using that piece to guide them across? And so finally, it's how do we do this, right? The example I gave of the client was they had a pretty simple comms tracker, but it did create visibility. So even though like the actual tool itself was pretty simple, it did create visibility for everything that was happening on that group's plate. Propeller has our own internal tracker that you can find on our website or that we can post the link for. And it's a standard change impact. It's similar to a standard change impact assessment, but it's meant to be over multiple initiatives. So that way I can say, okay, project A has these 5 groups impacted. Project B has these 6 groups. And then if you start adding up all of the impacts across all the different projects, I can start to see, okay, which groups are at risks over the timeline. So maybe Q3 is a no-go for this group, but Q4, Q1, things start to open up. And it's, again, I think the tool itself can be simple as long as you're creating that visibility and that data into how our different groups are experiencing those changes. But with that, I think we might be getting some questions. So I'll turn it over to see if we have any questions in the chat, or as Riley mentioned, I know we got a couple preemptively.
Yeah, a few preemptively that we received, Keely's. How would you structure organizationally to allow for this portfolio approach?
Yeah. So I think in an ideal world, we might have that PMO or CMO at a top level so that they are connecting the pieces across the board, right? Whether it's, again, the comms for my example, but someone who can see and deploy change managers across the whole organization. So they have that like high level visibility. However, I know that's like an idealistic scenario. So I think then when that's not an option, it's about creating change COEs or COPs if they're possible. So at least your change managers or at least your project managers are starting to talk to each other. And we're creating that. And this, again, that client example, it was the comms team was the gatekeeper for how things were launched out. But as long as someone's kind of being that gatekeeper and someone has that individual tracker of here's everything that's going out, we have some kind of visibility. Again, it can be simple way to see what's hitting different teams at different times.
Yeah, and a few conversations leading up to this, Keely. I was talking to a few folks who were in attendance about tools, and I think you mentioned one of the tools that we use, but are there additional tools that you've had experience with in creating this visibility?
Yeah, so I know there's some cool tech out there, and I've seen some good demos of different technology that's doing it. I think less about the tools. Again, the spreadsheet we have on our website is a good example, but it's just a spreadsheet. I think it's all about creating the visibility in the data. So finding something that your leadership reacts to, because it's more about how do I get these numbers, these colors, this high, medium, low impact in front of my leadership so that they can therefore make the decisions based off of that. And better yet, I don't want just to see red, yellow, green for like, hey, this is a high quarter year, or sorry, a high change quarter. I want to know this is a high change quarter for which groups. So that way we can be more strategic about not just, oh, Q3 is off limits, but like who is Q3 off limits for? Like what groups are going to be heavily impacted? So that way we can be more detailed in how we sequence things.
Yeah, and I think you'll touch on this on the next topic, but even thinking about your business's annual rhythms as we work across clients, and this may be a segue to your next topic, Keely, but we're often trying to ensure that we're not landing our change at the most critical time for their business, whether those are peak periods, whether those are talent calibration periods, whether that's quarter closes for finance. Those aren't traditional change impacts. Those are just our annual business rhythm. And so being very conscious of that, how we plan change and staff change. It's something that I found valuable for clients.
Yep, hugely important. And you like the big one is right. We don't roll out finance changes during end of year close. And same thing for retail. After Black Friday or before Black Friday through Christmas, there's no changes happening in retail clients, no matter what the change is. So being realistic to what your organization's periods, those blackout periods are, and then adjusting the calendars from there. And again, those aren't changes. Black Friday happens every year. It's just being realistic of what is the business schedule. But I think that's a good segue into our next topic, which is on capacity. And so the bad news is that we are human, and humans make up our organizations. Therefore, we have limitations. And that is, we do not have an endless capacity to take on change. So just as it's important for us to understand all the changes that are happening across the portfolio, it's also important for us to look at the saturation levels, to be an understanding of how our different teams are doing and where they sit. And to me, that's kind of the two key pieces of understanding the change landscape. So first was that portfolio level, and next is that saturation level. We'll kind of talk about this on our next slide. So in this little visual here with the boxes, and I'll talk through what I mean. So that blue box below, that's the capacity. That's the capacity for how much change we can take on. And if you start to count those squares, maybe you have a portfolio tracker, like I mentioned in the last topic, is your way to count those squares that are in front of you. And this is how much you can realistically take on. That's your change capacity. Versus that green point, that saturation point, occurs when the demand for change exceeds the organization's ability to absorb it. Everything above that, those gold squares, that's the fatigue. On an individual level, the fatigue symptoms are things like lack of engagement, burnout, attrition, anything that's causing the employee to disengage. On an organizational level, it might be an actual drop in your business results. So whatever the project or the change was promising to be the result, you're going to have lower results because, again, we just put too much on our employees and we're seeing that fatigue hit in. I think the better example and analogy we started using internally about this was to think of this as a bathtub, right? So the capacity is your bathtub and the impacts that are going in is the flow of the water. And whenever that fatigue hits is when the water starts spilling on the floor. So if we think of that analogy, that metaphor, it's kind of how are we filling or slowing the flow of water into the bathtub. And so you have three options really when it comes to understanding fatigue in this bathtub metaphor. So you have three options to do it. First is to reduce the demand or to reduce the flow of the water that is going into the tub. And so things like the portfolio tracker can help because you at least have visibility into the water that's into the tub and you have some visualization behind that. You can do things like adjust timelines. You can reprioritize or resequence work. That can all help slow or stop the flow of the water, at least temporarily. Anything that really can pause or lessen the work. And if you can pause or lessen or reprioritize, it's allowing your employees time to stabilize. Or in my metaphor, it's allowing time for the water to drain before you add more water. And that's an idealistic scenario because rarely do we have time or do we have control over the flow of the water. These are the changes, these are the priorities, these are the things that have to go out for our organization. And that's the key part of the water coming in. So then the other option is, if you can't slow the flow of the water enough, is to increase the capacity or the size of the tub. And so when we talk about increasing the capacity, there's a short-term and a long-term option here. Short-term would be to add more resources. So whether that's adding more change managers, project resources, releasing more comms, having more training, anything like that to allow the tub to get just a little bit bigger so we can take on more water, we can take on more changes. But again, that's a little bit short-term. And even though we know that the rate of change is increasing, we're not seeing an increasing the number of change manager roles that are out there. So it's not always like a long-term solution for our organizations. So I think the longer-term approach, therefore, is to build capability so that we can build the capacity of our organization. And what I mean by that is we want to build the skills within our people so that they better understand how change works and what it means so that they can take on more. When we talk about that, I particularly like to focus on our middle managers and above. So I want to talk about the people leaders in our organization because they are the key in unlocking this ability. And what I mean by that is change leadership. So just like when we think of the soft skills that we require of our managers, it's things like communication, giving feedback, creating strategy, all those key things that we expect of our managers. I like to add a bullet to that, I'm sure already very long list for a lot of us, is change leadership. How can we make everyone at our organization, particularly how can we make the managers at our organization better change leaders? And so what does that mean? It means teaching things like understanding what good communication looks like. It means recognizing what resistance looks like. It means being able to support during times of empathy or even understanding the change curve and the emotional things that come with it. So how can we do key things to increase the capacity of our tub by empowering our managers and above all the way to C-suite so that they can better understand what change, some of the key change management principles that maybe some of us take advantage of or take for granted. How can we enable everyone in our organization to understand those key principles? Because the truth is, if change is increasing to the rate Riley said, we can't do it all by ourselves. So how do we make everyone around us just like 5% of a change manager, just 5 to 10% of a change manager so that, again, that capacity increases? And so that might be through formal methods, like you tag in your L&D teams to form those workshops, those training, those courses, or through some more like lighter touch areas of how do we do coaching sessions or providing the tools and kits so that our different groups, again, managers and up, can embrace change and be better leaders through those moments of change. And I think on the Propeller side, we're seeing this demand shift a lot too. So we've been running a Change 101 workshop on and off for the last couple of years. And when we first started running it, it was more designed for the project manager side of the house or for L&D or for HR. And it was teaching, again, some of those fundamentals of change. But I think now we're seeing an increase in that workshop, but it's for more of the executive levels. Teams or executives want their teams to know how to lead change. They want them to be better communicators during times of change. They want them to lead during times of ambiguity. They want them to understand these like moments of resistance so that they can lead their teams out of it. So if we can, again, make everyone a little bit better at change management, we're increasing the capacity of that tub. We're increasing our ability to take on more change in this new environment. So I mentioned the first two options when it comes to this tub and the water flow. So that was to decrease the flow of water or to increase the size of the tub, which is usually the one I'm going to recommend. But the third option, and I think it's important to end here, is to accept the trade-offs, right? Sometimes we can't increase the tub big enough, or sometimes we can't slow the water fast enough. And so that's going to cause that fatigue, and that's going to cause that spillage. And that's okay as long as you're accepting that trade-off. As long as leaders know, hey, during this quarter or during this period, things are going to be really hectic. And so we're going to see a decrease in things like engagement or increase in burnout. We're going to have a trade-off. So you can accept the spillage of water onto the floor as long as you know the risk of doing it. And while I'll never support having that fatigue, I just think it's important to have visibility into that so you can accept that spillage, at least in the short term. And so you have a plan to get rid of that water later on. Finally, when we talk about tools to help, I think there's, again, lots of good resources out here in that portfolio tracker in whatever format you set it up in can help. Propeller also has a change saturation calculator. It's more of a diagnostic tool to kind of help you understand where your water level is at any given point in time. So that way you can go back and say, hey, we are past saturation point, and that's why we're seeing such high levels of disengagement, or we're getting close, or hey, we're actually in the clear right now, but we need to have a plan. So anything you can do to start kind of assessing this for your organization and what that might look like is pretty key, is the first step in understanding that saturation point. But with that, I want to pause and see if we have seen any questions that have come in from the chat.
Yeah, we had one come in from Garrett. Thank you. And Keely, I can kick us off and you can add too. But how do you decide if a change rollout needs to be delayed or canceled altogether? I think this bridges this topic into the next topic on adoption metrics as well. But my mind goes to adoption metrics. You have to have a perspective on what adoption means for your organization. We'll talk about that shortly in our next topic. But the way I view it, an end user has to be engaged. They have to learn something new and they have to behave in a new system, a new process. And so how do you begin to track those metrics across your population, your change audience? Will start to give you some understanding of, oh, we're not ready. And that's where we get into change readiness conversations. Sure. And whether the organization wants to delay or kind of push through. That's also a trade-off that we often see orgs building in is, does change management have the ability to say no? To have a no-go, or do we just say, hey, we're not ready, and this is the mitigative approach we have from a hypercare to ensure that readiness improves over time. But yeah, Keely, anything you would add there?
No, I think that answered it beautifully, and I don't want to steal from your next topic too much, but whatever we can do to whatever metrics you can set up early on, the better, so you can see how people are engaging with the change up early. So you should have that data hopefully plenty in advance. That shouldn't be happening 2 weeks before, because that's really kind of too late. So, but if I can be tracking the trends over time, then hopefully I can be keeping leadership up to date of, okay, here's how things are going up or down, or we need to make changes in their plans, so that if we do need to make that that call to push or delay altogether, we have the data to back us up long term.
The next question, we got this one ahead of this event. I love this one because I think there's a little bit of a metaphor here, but there's a realism to this question. And that's, how do you find the size of your organization's tub?
Yeah. So how do you level? There's no exact formula because it depends on your organization, right? So if you're at a 500 person organization, your tub's naturally going to look different than a 50,000 person organization. So when it comes to understanding it, you're going to be watching for those symptoms. So it's going to become if it's too late, then you're looking for those symptoms of fatigue. So that's things like disengagement, burnout, attrition, if that's happening. If you're doing any sentiment surveys or people are actually quoting those kinds of things, that's how you'll start to measure fatigue. When it comes to capacity, you're watching for those warning signs of people starting to disengage, things starting to slow down. And as we kind of allude to Riley's next topic, if we're looking at the business results, are the projects that we initially promised these grand results for, they're not being as successful, and it's not the technology's fault. So then where what's happening if it's not the technology or the org structure's fault. So then there must be something else happening. And I think those symptoms are the best way to start to diagnose how big your capacity is as an organization, like at least at first, so that you can, at least as you get better at honing down on, okay, here's too much looks like, here's what too little looks like, and finding those kind of key pieces in between.
And then I think you may have answered this one, but let me ask it anyway. You mentioned some formal methods on building your capability. Change leadership training was one example you gave, but what are some of the informal kind of methods that helps build that capability, build that tub up for organizations?
Yeah. So some of it, I've seen a couple of different approaches. So a lot of times it's creating the resources and making them available. So again, it could be something like a workshop or a micro learning in the smaller page. I've done anything from creating quick job aids or resources, SharePoint pages, those kinds of key pieces that you can like share with people as the needs arise. I think also what I've seen most successful is to tap into any of your governance structures. So just as we might set up a champion network on a project to make these big advocates for the project itself and for that change, when it comes to making an advocate for change management itself, it's how do we weave into our existing governance structures? So does that mean I need to get onto any of the manager forums? Does that mean I need to get into like the very formal ones, like onboarding through growth and skills pieces, through the more informal ones, like maybe a Slack channel or maybe some of your SharePoint pages? How do we like target people at different ways so they can engage with the content or the capabilities in a meaningful and sometimes small way as well? But with that, I
That's
think
all
that,
we have on this topic.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I'll
Perfect.
pass.
Yeah, let me take us to our third topic around adoption not being the finish line business value is. To ultimately kind of position change as a key cog within your transformation capability, for you to operate at a portfolio level, for you to measure that saturation, as Keely talked about, to track that change across diverse stakeholder segments, even Garrett's question there, it's beneficial for you to develop a robust change measurement approach. I don't know how many times I've been asked by a client on the ROI of change, like, what's the value of change management here? There's plenty of literature on this, right? You can answer statistically from research that failed transformations. There's a wide variety of studies that 75 to 88% fail to meet the value without effective change, right? That the success of the highest, effective CM change management performers, the super change performers out there, drive 143% project value. Again, can link these studies at a later time, and how adoption accelerates the value, directly translating to financials. 2.5x revenue growth. We've seen studies in that space, but the literature doesn't seem to be enough. It doesn't, quell that desire to know what's the value you're bringing to the team. And why isn't it not enough? I don't think it's communication and awareness of the research. Maybe it can be, hey, why don't I share these studies with you and let's walk through them and let me share the value of change management. But I think it's two things: one that we can't solve for, and one that we can. First, there's an inherent statistical problem. Correlation of adoption to business results it's not causal, right? Just because you have perfect adoption doesn't mean you hit value 100% of the time, because the strategy could have been wrong, the technology could have failed, we chose the wrong technology, the processes could be sharper, our employees have the wrong skill. Like, there's a lot that goes into you landing the desired business outcome of that change. Adoption, one of those things, but not the only thing. And so we have a statistical causation problem that I'm not here to solve. I do not have a master's degree in that space. I'm not willing to be on this call to chat you through that. But rather than rely on the research, I think the second thing that we can solve, why not establish that tailored, unique correlation for your own organization rather than rely on trend lines of research done years ago? Because relying on those trend lines from the past studies doesn't account for your change history, your culture, its people, the company size, its change inertia, its capability, its bathtub size, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you are unique. Your organization is unique. Its people are unique. And so having an understanding of the linkage between adoption to results is unique to your company. And if you can begin tracking these on both fronts, which means that the business actually has to set business KPIs. That's another problem on its own front. Then you can begin to establish company-specific trend line. And now you can tell that change story, that change ROI story that's local to your company, not dependent on research. Okay. And so as you go to the next slide, how do you get there? You need to first have a perspective on adoption and what are acceptable metrics. You'll see a framework that we use on this slide, and percentage thresholds that give you confidence that adoption will occur. We know we can't hit 100%. We can't have 100% engagement. The training can't go up for 100% without an itch. We can't have 100% knowledge perfection before go live. And we can't expect 100% behavior from the humans who have multitude of things cross-functionally, cumulatively, etc. We'd have to hire lots of individual change managers to get to 100%. So we all have to accept a threshold of what we need to drive to prove adoption. At Propeller, we view adoption as the bottom three levels, those three different kind of gold colors. Engagement builds to learning, learning builds to behavior, and with behavior change, we can expect business results. In our opinion, based off of our research that we've done in a multitude of ways, we believe a minimum threshold of 60% engagement, 70% learning, stacking up to 80% behavior are a good starting point for thresholds. We'll talk more on that in a short time. And we've done research on that in three ways. We've interviewed our kind of senior change management experts. We've looked at our past change client work to see, hey, when we had adoption at this level, did it lead to business success? And actually, when I spoke on this topic at ACMP, I had folks, informal research method here, raise their hands from 0 to 100 when they thought that's the threshold they'd like. And it generally landed in this space, this 60 engagement, 70 learning, 80% behavior. You then have to track those legacy metrics and stay in touch with how the business case bared out, right? Did adoption lead to business outcomes? Business outcomes don't happen at go live. They usually happen 6 months after go live, a year after go live, whether it was something around talent retention, whether it was something around cycle times, number of tickets that the office supported, right? Like those metrics come later. And so to have the rigor to then go and track your business results is part of this. At that point, you can say, did adoption lead to business success? At what degree? At what degree did we save 200% time or did we save 110% time on tickets? Right? And that linkage, as I alluded to, is not causal, but it's a linkage. And with that large enough sample size of projects over time, that linkage can strengthen as evidence that you can, as a change manager, know how adoption drives business value. So this is a long game. You have to have that perspective on what adoption metrics mean for your organization. You can often use history, right? You can go backwards and say, oh, wow, when we had this level of adoption, it worked for us. And I imagine that each organization is unique in this and that each project could have different thresholds. A reorg might have higher thresholds versus a technology implementation that everybody's asking for and is excited for might have lower thresholds. I think having a foundation of 60, 70, 80 or whatever numbers you determine is great. And you can kind of monitor that or update that based off the projects you're running. Okay. Without putting a ton of dummy data out there, for those who would want a more of a visual or an exploration of dummy data of this linkage, happy to set up time to kind of walk you through some screenshots of this exercise in action of something that we've been doing at Propeller to say, hey, adoption, yes, business success, yes, and how do you then establish the value that comes out of that? So a couple of last notes on this topic, a difficult topic nonetheless. Adoption thresholds, as I mentioned, may vary by type of change. One type of change may be more difficult than another. And as you develop that historical data, updating these thresholds, it may be something that you do on an annual basis based off of your change history and the change capability you're building. If you have a strong change capability in it, for instance, you might be able to get away with lower thresholds because your audience knows that change happens to work at your organization. If you have a very poor change history and very poor and high change inertia, a high proponent of status quo, then you might want to boost your thresholds because your change audience It's going to be more of a pain in moving through your respective changes. And so that is, you can kind of go back to these thresholds and update them based off of what you're seeing in the flesh as you go through different projects. And you can start to compare kind of yeses and nos as it relates to where those thresholds overlap as it relates to your business success on projects. Another note, success should be defined by the business result the change was intended to create. As I mentioned, that means your business actually has to set a KPI and track it. And so that's not on you necessarily, but you can be a nudger for such in hopes that you can start to establish that linkage. And again, if you're starting to do this and you're starting to get proof points that help you tell the story of the value of change management, this can then help you with resourcing and planning across a portfolio of projects, connecting back to some of the early topics that Keely's mentioned. So with that, I think I want to stop and see if there's any other questions that came in on this specific topic. I'll turn over to Keely.
Yeah. So we had a couple from before, Riley, that I'll start you off with.
Yep.
So first is, what are the types of metrics you prefer to measure adoption?
Yeah, so if you go back to the previous slide, this pyramid, early in the project, you're only really measuring engagement, or sometimes what we call sentiment. And so finding different questions to ask about their level of awareness around the change, whether they support it, level of excitement, are types of metrics you can track throughout the entirety of the project. As Keely mentioned in our last question, if you're doing that early and often enough, and as you're putting out different change tactics, we should see those numbers grow in terms of their sentiment and engagement for the change. Of course, learning can't start until you begin that training window. And so you're really relying on engagement. That's why it's the base. That's why it's the biggest component of this pyramid. As you get up to learning, the basics that we see out there, not what I'd advocate, is a training completion, right? Or, visiting an intranet or downloading a job aid, etc. What I would look for is more knowledge checks that they're actually executing and showing that they understand the change going forward. And you can do those through like digital adoption platforms as one example, and LMSs to understand, okay, my folks actually are getting and understanding what they need to do. And then, of course, behavior, whether it's a system change, you can do those in like sandboxes, or you actually can utilize the system metrics post go live to see logins or performance against key workflows. If it's a non-system change, it's probably checking in with like your people manager audience, say it was a performance management change, and getting feedback iteratively from them on how it's being perceived and received. And so those behavior moments are the key ones. And of course, as you work up the pyramid, as you get higher, those become more important. Like my behavior metrics are more important than my engagement metrics as I get further along. But Keely, what else would you add?
I think you hit a lot of the great ones. The only one I'd potentially add is pilots. So pilot groups can be really important for really all three of those, or I guess all four, but particularly in that behavior. So if I can start with a small group, whether it's a small audience or just like a small section of the technology, for example, or a small section of the processes, how can we learn from those individual, like in that smaller, safer environment before we did the whole thing, like before we did the whole bang? Because that allows you to take those lessons learned and therefore get a better, Riley, to your point, measure on where those different metrics are, or where those thresholds for each of those different levels. And I think a pilot is a great way to get a feel for your organization and the thresholds that you need to be successful. Okay, so you had another question, and it's how does our change history and or performance dictate how we should set adoption thresholds?
Yeah, I did talk about this a little bit. Let me try to go into a little bit more specific. If you do have documentation of, hey, you've been a change manager for 3 years, you've ran an assortment of projects, you have those metrics you can go reflect back on, I'd grab all those projects, put them in a spreadsheet, track if you're following our pyramid, if you have engagement, learning, behavior metrics, and you can start to see your success just from an adoption perspective. Like if you adopt the 60, 70, 80 thresholds that I mentioned, go through each of them and say, hey, yes, we hit that checkpoint. No, we didn't hit that checkpoint. And then on kind of the column outside of adoption, if you can track your business metrics with just a simple binary yes or no, If you don't have business KPIs, you could go to the change sponsors and say, hey, was this business a success wholesale? Did it actually drive what you were looking to accomplish with this project? And just even getting simple binary yeses, nos on those projects, you can take all of your yeses of business results and just go look at your thresholds, go look at your adoption metrics and say, all right, for the ones that actually drove business value, this is the adoption that was required to do that. And you can start to run different averages, means, etc., generate error bars as it relates to those thresholds, to not just rely on our expertise on the 60, 70, 80, but develop your own. And so that's one way you can kind of go backwards, look at your legacy data, compare it to the business outcome, and generate your own thresholds.
Sure. And the only thing I add to that maybe, Riley, is what I loved about that question, and kind of you queued this up, is the change history. And I think a lot of us come with these change scars in our organizations, and that plays a big piece into how we're going to impact our changes later. So if I've been with clients and they'll say, well, 10 years ago, this change went poorly. And I want to be like, this was 10 years ago, and it's still top of mind for this other somewhat related change. So taking that into account of that, like there's those small things that kind of feed into your organization's ability and their own individual thresholds for change. So maybe in that case, someone who's quoting a project from 10 years ago, their threshold needs to be a lot higher because that change history feels very relevant to them into that situation. Oh, cool. All right, Riley. We got a question in the chat for you. So pinning a business result to a specific change adoption can be tricky, especially when change is systematic. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I think I alluded to this, and this is where I was saying, hey, adoption to business value, it's not causal. It's dependent on lots of factors. It's dependent on your strategy. It's dependent on the market. It's dependent on your organization's employees to carry that forward. And so that's what I would always, if you are going forward with this approach, I'd be very honest in your ability to establish that linkage, and I would explore that with your business sponsors, your managers, and see if this is a worthy exploration, or if the research that's out there that there is enough buy-in from your change leadership around doing this work and the value that change management provides projects. If that's already there, then this is more of an exercise for yourself to geek out on. I tend to leverage this when we are getting pushback on the value of change, what it brings to the table. And I try to educate and, through the literature, through the research, and through the statistical causation problem, that we can't come to you and say, hey, by implementing this project, we are going to successfully drive this value, right? And so it's in those moments when I say, hey, if we want to do this exploration, we're happy to sit down and look through our legacy of projects and start to establish that linkage. That linkage is not something that linkage, gets more powerful with the larger sample size. And so just, looking at one or two projects, that linkage doesn't have a large enough sample data size, in my opinion, to go to bat for that, that correlation that you're trying to establish. So I don't think I have a great answer. I think it is tricky, particularly when change is systematic and there's multiple business results that this change is potentially infusing or informing. But I'd say probably start with whether the exercise is worthy enough and whether you have enough change support across your organization. But Keely, other thoughts? What did I miss in kind of rapid fire there?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And it is tricky because how does, a new ERP system result in better, sales for the system than for the business result? Like that's ultimately what we're trying to do. But then how do sales tie back to like the training that we took for our employees? And so you're making a lot of like connective pieces along the way of, okay, we have to tie comms or training or change activities to actual business sales. And so there's a lot of things that have to happen in between. And was it truly just change's problem, or was something broken in the technology, or was something happening in the market? Like there's a lot of things that are in our control and out of our control. So when it comes to identifying those pieces, I would start by understanding what is in fact in our control, like what the system itself or our people, versus out of our control, like the market itself. And then once you start to like separate out those, then I think you can start to tie back in, well, when we did this better training, we had a better understanding, we went to market faster. That's also where those things like those pilots can be helpful. So starting to tie back what are those things that we can relate back to how we deployed it, how our people felt ready, how we showed up as an organization and as a people in order to drive those business results. Because again, we can't control the taxes or the inflation rate or the sales market, but we can control of how we showed up as an organization. And those we can usually try to tie back to, our individual change initiatives.
And this is why you have two people on a call. I think the ERP example helped me build on your answer. Like that's just there's so many multiple outcomes that
Yeah.
you're driving through a large transformation like that. And so probably indexing more on projects that have a very clear, we are doing this to improve our attrition rates. It's like that is the one outcome. We think this one process or this one change is going to help us get to lower attrition rates. Okay, now it's kind of clear that we're doing this one thing dedicated to this one outcome. And now adoption, while again, the strategy, the process, the people implementing are important, that linkage can be a little bit stronger. So probably prioritizing those projects that have less systemic, less complexity around that linkage.
Sure. And there's a follow-up question to this from Suzanne. So do you help identify how to create synergy by bundling projects across the portfolio that will reinforce each other, driving the desired outcomes? I think this is a good point and definitely a good opportunity, because I think if we can group like changes, or if we can adjust the timeline so that similar ones are going out together or all like towards these markets, we can, when it comes to our aspects, like how do we bundle our comms together, our training, our engagement, our champion networks, how do we push all of these key driving moments together so that we have less, ideally, so that we can bother people less, so that we have like one big newsletter, one big champion network, all those like traditional methods. But it does require that portfolio view. It does require me to say, okay, hey, here are the ones that make sense to bundle together. And then to bring it to Riley's final point of like, how do we bring those to those, or like tie those to those desired outcomes? Bundling can be key because it reduces work, it reduces strain on the employees. I think it will make things trickier when it comes to tying adoption metrics to individual projects once they're bundled. But I do think it's a really good way to hopefully reduce the flow of the water into that capacity tub.
I have one more that came in ahead of time. I'm surprised we didn't see more on this, but it's how are we seeing AI tie into this new change landscape? I'll do a couple of quick thoughts and Keely, let you organize on this. But if you think back to the start of this presentation, AI definitely contributing to fast, definitely contributing to surprising. Pretty sure it's contributing to cumulative. So it's an input to like this new landscape full sail, right? And I think the thing that I would call out is how we as change managers get on that parallel path with what AI is doing to the change landscape and making sure that we are leveraging it to enhance our outputs, enhance our ability to be speedier in our assessment of change impacts, our ability to put together change our communications and engagement tactics. And so while it is contributing to this largely new change universe, I think how we position ourselves to utilize it to help shepherd change in this universe is just as important.
Yeah. Plus one to everything in that. The number of use cases we can find to make AI or to use AI to help us be more efficient in our job allows us to move faster. That's always a big thing. But I think the other thing that kind of shows up, and it showed up in our Insights report earlier this year, is because of all of this AI, the need for human connection is even greater. Right. So while we're producing content, we're producing like all this amazing stuff so quickly, but also there's this need to bring it down to the more human connection level. So we might have these beautiful talking points or beautiful slides or beautiful content we can produce with the help of AI. But then how do we bring it back to the personal level? And we're seeing a lot of that strain come on our middle level, that middle manager level again. But I think that's in some ways can be good, is how do we encourage those human connections, especially during times of change or during periods of high influx. So that way we can, utilize AI to help us move faster, but also bring up the people front and center just as much as well.
Great. Well, appreciate all of those who took the survey ahead of this call, engaged in us in conversation one-on-one ahead of this call, dropped in a few of those questions ahead of this call, and those who dropped in questions during the call as well. appreciative of the time for us to kind of geek out together. Me and Keely enjoy these types of forums and be able to kind of put out there what we're thinking of, what we're seeing across our clients and in different industries we serve. We mentioned throughout the talk, if there's certain tools, certain things that we have on our website, please reach out. Happy to put those together for you, send you a quick email. In addition to just connecting with you on these topics via LinkedIn, happy to support you in any of those ways and look forward to seeing you soon on another one of these forums.